So, hello. Today we have Anastacia with us, who is a published author. She recently published a book, Eat Like a Pig, Run Like a Horse. And I know that some of you guys would probably be interested in this topic. So, I asked her to sit with us for an interview, and she kindly agreed. Her first book was Combat Ready: How the US Military Shapes What We Eat. Anastacia, do you want to tell us a little bit about the book?
The old book was actually I started out as being a food writer,
Mhm.
and I became very interested in what I like to call industrial food, and had done a few pieces on that. At one point, I'm also a mother. I was putting together some lunches for my daughters, and I realized that all the items that I was putting into their lunch boxes were things that had long shelf lives, bread and cold cuts and cheese and little snack foods. And so after I finished that, I went off and started to do some research on the food science behind extended shelf life. And I found at the origins of two of those items, for the bread and the cold cuts, I found this mention of what to me at the time was an obscure U.S. military base, which was called the Natick Soldier Systems Center. It turned out to be 15 minutes from my house, and there they do research on food science, or fund research on food science to help create combat rations. And
Okay.
that food science because of World War II and because the US wanted to maintain preparedness, they kept sort of making sure that this private sector could support them. So that food science gets spread to the consumer food industry. And that's the link.
Okay. And was it then that you moved from being a food writer into more of a food science writer?
Correct. I mean, obviously, when you're dealing with how to preserve food, you really have to understand
Yes.
the science of, well, food microbiology. So I kind of did a quick course in that, and then actually the food itself is has many scientific elements that you have to be able to control to create food products, including that it's actually a very unusual mixed system of different molecules that behave differently at different temperatures. So I ended up getting quite deep into the science there.
So you wrote your first book in 2015, and then now you're back with your second book. What really inspired you to write this book, Eat Like a Pig and Run Like a Horse?
Actually is a third book in between those two books,
Oh,
which
okay.
is going to be published
Okay.
after this after after the second book. And that book is a defense of processed food. And there I defended processed food on four grounds. When I began to do the research in the public health chapter, of course, I was looking at, processed food is the cause of the obesity epidemic, and it's our diets. Looking further into that, and began to wonder what the impact of the incredible lack of exercise that most people have had on their health. And it became apparent that, over time, we have become just increasingly immobile. Certainly by the 1950s, with cars and shifts in occupations to being more sedentary, and then our love affair with screens.
You've had a personal journey as well with your own health when you started exercising. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. And I will say it wasn't quite so much a eureka moment as a very slow, or it was a very slow-mo eureka moment,
I
because
mean,
it took me a long time to actually conclude, okay, this must be doing something. But yeah, when I was in my 20s, I had the experience of, waking up one morning and not having feeling in, it started off in a hand and then progressed to the rest of one side of my body. I went to see a neurologist, and at that time, which was in the 90s, MRIs were just coming on the scene, and so I was diagnosed without that. And he said, you can have there are three possibilities here. It could be an anomaly, it could be a brain tumor, or it could be multiple sclerosis. Of three of those choices were very upsetting, of course, and when you're in your mid 20s. And I sort of fled from being ill, I ended up leaving sort of my career, which is more oriented towards policy and academia, and going off and living in South America for a while. And there I ended up having a second one of these episodes and found that I had a number of lesions on my brain, which is typical of multiple sclerosis. And that became my first diagnosis. It was just before interferon-based therapies were available, but I focused on self-care.
Yeah.
And one of the legs of that was daily exercise. At that time, I swam, I walked. I didn't start running, which I now do, until several years later in 2002, actually, because I was pregnant and I was projectile vomiting and twisted a shoulder and could no longer swim. I started running every day and have not stopped since then. And since that time, I have never had another MS flare up.
It's interesting because my most recent YouTube video was about running, endurance running and marathon running, and why everyone should run a marathon. I got a lot of flack for it online.
Did you? Well,
I
so
did,
what
yeah.
kind of flack did you get?
There were a lot of different arguments. Big one was running is bad for your knees, avoid it at all costs.
Right.
And the other was why run a marathon or why run long distances when you could just run 1 or 2 miles every day.
I'm so glad you framed it that way, because it really goes to really what I think the central point of my book is, which is what vigorous physical activity like running, and maybe you could do it cycling, or maybe you could do it with the Stairmaster, the gym, for a long period of time. The impact on your cardiovascular system, that it's strengthened, blah, 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 that's wonderful. But there's a whole other level. And this is what I think people really don't get when they're thinking food is medicine. Well, no, food is not medicine. We don't inject carbohydrates and the lipids and proteins in when we're sick, or take pills that include those. What vigorous physical activity does is it creates all these new substances, these new molecules that are then communicating. Most people know the example of endorphins.
Yeah.
Which is, a hormone. And one of the best ways to get endorphins is to exercise. Well, when you exercise, often create these new molecules that then have anti-inflammatory effects where they elevate mood, or, they reduce stress. It's that you're seeking with vigorous physical activity.
I think at the end of the research phase, when I was creating that YouTube video, I came to the conclusion that it's really a function of two things. Ideally, you want to pick a sport or any form of exercise where it's vigorous enough that you're really stressing out your body. That's one. And two, you can do it for a prolonged period of time. And obviously, those two things don't correlate. So I think marathon running and endurance running tends to balance these things quite well. You get both the duration, where you're producing these molecules for a long time, and you're also getting the exercise intensity, where you're producing a lot of these molecules.
Yes. Exactly. So, and one of the interesting things in the book has this title, Eat Like a Pig, Run Like a Horse, which, yes, it refers to, if you eat like a pig, you better run like a horse. In the book, I use animals to take a look at the issue of obesity and lifestyle diseases. What I learned from that was that so many animals are almost, I won't say constantly in motion, but spend a great deal of their waking lives in motion. Little tiny mice who run 4 to 6 miles a day, or bats that really perform the nightly equivalent of 4 ultramarathons just in looking for their food. We are part of that same family. Regular movement is baked into our design, and therefore our well-being. Going back to your question about why running rather than swimming, I have a feeling that when you're in the water, you're constantly cooling because of the temperature of the water. And when I run, I definitely get quite hot and sweaty. Going back to these bats, which have very high levels of something called a heat shock protein, which we all have at a baseline level. You have more if you're in a warm climate. And when you exercise, these get produced in much greater quantities, and then they persist, and they help deal with inflammation throughout your body.
It's actually quite interesting that you mentioned animals, because I guess animals don't really have a diet culture. Can you I think that was terrible.
You know what? It reminded me though. You
That does
reminded me of
not
something
make
that I
any
forgot to
sense.
say. I want you to weave it in, which is that I told you about sort of the first level of the title of my book. There's a second level which should come through with the animals inside the book, which refers to the fact that we are most like pigs and horses, and that we are omnivores like pigs. We have kind of an indestructible gastrointestinal system. We can really scarf down quite a bit of stuff and thrive, and that we are sweaters and runners like horses. So
Okay.
that there's also that meaning there. Back to the pig level, I think
Yeah.
that's where you want it to go, which is animals don't really discriminate again about what they're eating. If food appears, they eat it. And in the natural world, of course, that would be fine because they're going about doing their business. And let's talk about the examples of pigs, actually, because this is, we think of fat pigs. Well, fat pig is a pig that you have raised as livestock. It's possibly penned in and not going around, certainly not going around looking for food. But a wild pig, in the course of just looking for enough food, they are constantly moving, and they have a very different sort of physique than a pig that you might raise for food.
Would you say that humans are pretty much the same?
Yeah, I think I would, but I think the important point is that, especially for humans, I don't think there's any particular ideal diet. I think one of our evolutionary advantages is that we figured out how to eat pretty much anything wherever we located around the world, from seals to tubers and grubs. But an animal, at least in the natural world, of course, is roaming around looking for its food. It's not, sitting in an apartment, opening the fridge and just eating whatever. And so in the course of consuming that food, it's going to get a great deal of exercise.
There was a paper by Ding et al. That was recently published that kind of made that argument that you can't really outrun your bad food choices. And I know that you've had a chance to look at that paper. So, what are your thoughts about it?
I actually, when that came out, I emailed Dr. Ding, and she sent me a copy of the study. And I actually shared it with someone who I've interviewed for the book, who's Glenn Gaser at Arizona State University. And so we looked at it together, and we emailed a bit. And unfortunately, the press has kind of taken it and sort of said, you need to be watching your diet, and you can't, exercise isn't enough. Well, no, that's actually not what the paper shows. Even in the abstract for the article and in the conclusions, they say that physical activity did, in fact, reduce mortality in all the different categories. They looked at more than the best diet. With vigorous physical activity that we're talking about, eating a bad diet, you could reduce your mortality in the cardiovascular category by about 25%. So what is not being said here is that physical activity was a much greater factor in health than the diet. And so unfortunately, the headlines have not really made that distinction.
Yeah, no, I agree with you because the paper was literally everywhere and it was the same headline in all the media outlets. And then I actually got a chance to read the paper, and then I was like, the paper does not say this.
Yes, I know. It's
It was
crazy because you look at
very
the paper.
confusing.
The first thing the paper says is that there was a definite reduction in mortality, all-cause mortality, and CVD mortality with physical activity, both moderate and vigorous. And then it says there was some reduction with diet, but it didn't raise to statistical significance. It's like, and then at the very, very end, I was going to look for this because I thought it was so. They say, okay. Furthermore, our data provide evidence that high levels of physical activity did not fully counteract the detrimental effects of a poor diet on mortality risk. So I think that fully is really the key word there.
Or
It
the
almost does.
tangent.
And that's what Glenn Gaser, the person I spoke, he said, it says you can almost outrun the effects. But so, yeah, yes, it has some impact, but the more important thing is to be physically active.
I guess the difference between exercise and diet choices is that diet choices is something that you can stop doing, as in, I can choose not to eat this hamburger. While with exercise, I have to choose to actually do something rather than not do something. Psychologically, in terms of motivation, it's just a lot harder for people to do something rather than not do something.
I mean, we can. This is one of those topics too. We could just keep going all day. So the other thing I think that maybe perhaps is going on in our era is, I think the world feels very chaotic to people, And having that kind of diet where you're sort of imposing this structure over your life is some measure of comfort.
I think that might, have something to do with the rise of in eating disorders that we're currently seeing right now. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think one of the things I that is beneficial about exercise, that it gives you a sense of positivity about your body, no matter what your shape. For somebody who has that sort of disordered eating, focusing on being physically active and feeling your body in good health, no matter if you have a few extra pounds, can be incredibly rewarding. I also wanted to make another point about a reason people don't exercise, and I don't really know how to sort of get over that hump. But I think one reason people don't exercise is they don't feel good, in the sense that it makes them get sweaty, makes them get hot, makes them get out of breath, and they feel tired. But one of the things I was noticing when I was, of course, researching, those are actually signs that the exercise is doing its wonders on your body. And the fact that you're getting sweaty means you're getting hot, and your body is going to have to deal with that heat somehow, and it's going to create these new molecules, which are going to create an anti-inflammatory effect.
That's definitely something to be celebrated rather than something to kind of be upset about. I guess that's where like science education and public health can probably play a role in educating people about,
Yeah,
what's
that's true.
happening,
That's true.
what's happening inside their bodies when they're exercising. So I wanted to ask you, just to end the interview, is there any food that you would, or groups of food perhaps, that you would avoid at all costs? Just stay away from.
Should I never eat this food?
Never eat this ever.
Should I confess that I have a collection of Coca-Cola T-shirts in multiple languages? No, I drink it. I only occasionally. I don't think, actually, no. There's no food that I would say is off limits
Okay.
as a treat. And a small Coke with some ice on a very hot summer day is delicious. It's a treat. That said, eat your vegetables. Vegetables are wonderful. I'm glad you have a broccoli there. I'm a big fan of vegetables. And yes, I would not, neither juice nor soda I would not drink a lot of, but as a treat, I don't think anything's off limits.
Think that wraps our interview for today. Thank you, Anastasia, for, did I pronounce that name right?
You
I'm
did
so
it
sorry.
perfectly. Thank you. That
For
was a
joining
lot of
us.
fun. Thank you, Nisham.
You've been very generous with your time. And for everyone watching this video, there should be a link to Anastasia's book on Amazon. So check that link below.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure chatting with you, Nisham.